This is Geometry, Unit 7, Day 9 worksheet. We're working on the right triangle trigonometry. What we're looking for here in the first questions is find the sine of R. Well, we know that using the term SOH CAH TOA, sine is opposite over hypotenuse, cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, and tangent is opposite over adjacent. Using that concept, to find the sine of R, we start with sine, or we start with the S. We start with the R. And sine is opposite over adjacent, OH, opposite over hypotenuse. The sine of R would be 24 over 26. You're welcome to reduce that. With a calculator, you would get 0.9231. The sine of S is opposite over hypotenuse. So the ratio of that is 10 over 26. You can reduce that fraction. The decimal version is 3846. When we write out the decimal version, we like to have 4 decimal spots for the accuracy. The cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. So from R, adjacent means next to. Hypotenuse is across from the 90. So this is 10 over 26, 0.3846. And the cosine of S is 24 over 26, 0.9231. Tangent is opposite over adjacent. So tangent of R, meaning we stand at the R location. From the R's point of view, the opposite over the adjacent, 24 over 10 is 2.4. From the S, 10 over 24, 4166. Notice that sine and cosine will always be less than 1 because the denominator is always the hypotenuse. The hypotenuse is the biggest side. So sine and cosine will always be a fraction that's less than 1. Sine of R. With this triangle, here's your R. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse, so 28 over 53, the decimal version of that. The cosine of R, adjacent over hypotenuse, and the tangent of R, opposite over adjacent. From S, the sine is opposite over hypotenuse. The decimal version is 8490. The cosine from S is adjacent over hypotenuse. The tangent of S, tangent is OA. Tangent is opposite over adjacent. That's what SOH CAH TOA is for. It tells you how to set up the fraction. Tangent is opposite over adjacent. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. and sine is opposite over hypotenuse. So when we're looking for the tangent of S, we start at S, and from this point of view, we look at the opposite, and we look at the adjacent. And those are both going to be legs. So we have 45 over 28. And that decimal comes out to be 1.6071. Okay, we can also use trigonometry to solve for a missing side. Notice here we have a right triangle. Okay, sine, cosine, and tangent can only be used in a right triangle. Here we do not have a 45, 45, 90 triangle or even a 30, 60, 90. We have a 41 degree angle. We could calculate the other acute angle, but that's not going to be extremely helpful in solving this, so we'll just stick with the 41. We have to look at what we're trying to solve for. We have to first, from the 41, we have the opposite side and we have the hypotenuse. So from the 41, what trig function would that be? Remember, the acronym SOH CAH TOA can help remind what opposite over hypotenuse is. That's the OH, so that's sine. So sine of 41 is going to be 17 over D. Now if you have a letter in the denominator, you need to multiply that to the other side. That's going to cross out the D from this side of the equal sign. And then we would divide by the sine of 41. Be sure you don't just say by 41, because that's not true. It has to be the sine of 41. So D equals our 17 over sine of 41. And with the calculator, that'll come out to be 25.9. Next, we'll look for letter C. How could we calculate C? C is considered to be the adjacent side. It's the side next to. The adjacent side. So opposite, we have that number. Adjacent, we're looking for that number. And we know the angle. So we can use tangent of 41 because tangent deals with opposite and adjacent. The opposite is 17. The adjacent is C. Multiply by that denominator. Divide by the tangent of 41. And when we do that, we're going to get 17 over tangent of 41, which comes out to be 1956. So we have a leg of 17, we have a leg of 1956, and we have a hypotenuse of 25.9. That seems reasonable because the hypotenuse is the longest side. You always want to check your work to be sure that some of those easy facts are taken care of. We'll look here at the next example. First thing that we need to do is look from the angle. From the angle, the T is considered the opposite side. The U is considered the adjacent side. And the 32 is considered the hypotenuse. So if we're going to try to figure out what t is, we can only find one letter at a time. So t is going to be opposite, and we need to use the hypotenuse. So opposite hypotenuse is sine. Sine of 51 equals the opposite side over the hypotenuse. So we'll multiply by 32. Cross those out. So now we know that t is going to equal 32 times the sine of 51. And using a calculator, we'll get 2487. That gets us our value 2487. So now we know two sides. You could use Pythagorean theorem now, but that's always a little bit tougher just when the numbers are decimals. Makes it a little bit more challenging. We could look here and say adjacent over hypotenuse, which is the cosine of 51. Adjacent over hypotenuse. Multiply both sides by the denominator. So when I multiply both sides by the denominator, they cross out. I have my 32 on the other side. When I multiply this with a calculator, I get 20.14 for my value of u. Notice, using trigonometry, there's no need to go through Pythagorean theorem. Typically, we use Pythagorean theorem if we know two sides, but in these cases, we only know one side and one acute angle. Find the area and the perimeter of the triangle. So, to find the area, we need to know the base times the height. And remember, base times the height has to be perpendicular to each other. So finding this other leg is going to help you calculate the area. For the perimeter, you're going to need to know all three sides so you can add them all together. So this is going from the 56, this is considered the adjacent side because it's next to. This is considered the opposite side. This is still considered the hypotenuse. In terms of finding the area, this could be considered your base, and this could be considered your height. So, if we're going to calculate the area, we need to know what the height is. So I'm going to use the ratio that deals with opposite and adjacent. Well, my reminder, using SOH CAH TOA, my reminder that opposite and adjacent, that would be tangent. Opposite over adjacent. So I'm going to say the tangent of 56 is the opposite side. That's our unknown. Okay, we'll call that h. Over the adjacent, which is 40. We multiply both sides by that 40. we calculate this, we're going to get 59.3. Okay, so now to find the area, area equals half the base times the height. The base, we've called that to be 40. The height is 59.30. So using our calculator, we see we get 1,186. .05, and our units are inches squared. Area is always squared. Then it also asks us for the perimeter. To calculate the perimeter, you need to know the length all the way around the shape. So the side we don't know yet is the hypotenuse. Now I would suggest to use the 40. Don't use the 59.30. When you're going to calculate an unknown, you want to use the information that they've already given you. So I'm going to use the adjacent and hypotenuse. Adjacent hypotenuse, so that's cosine. So cosine of 56 is going to equal the adjacent over the hypotenuse. Now to calculate that, we're going to multiply both sides by this hypothetical term called hypotenuse. So now we're going to take the hypotenuse times the cosine of 56, and we know that that's supposed to equal 40. So I'm going to divide by the cosine so I can get the hypotenuse by itself. And when we take 40 divided by the cosine of 56 with your calculator, you'll get 71.53. So the perimeter is going to be 40. It's going to be 59.3 and 71.53. So we have 170.8 inches. And we can abbreviate that with IN. That's how far it is around the outside of the triangle. On the flip side, we're looking at a chairlift, and we see that it has an angle of elevation of 28 degrees. It covers a distance of 4,640 feet. We're looking for the vertical height. What is the height that the chair lift will take you? Well, we have to look here and decide what information do we have. We have the angle. We're using the opposite side, and we're also using across from the 90, which is the hypotenuse. So, thinking of SOH CAH TOA, opposite over hypotenuse, that's sine. So we're going to use sine of 28, which equals the opposite side over the hypotenuse. Now one way to solve this is to put it into a proportion and cross multiply. So we'll get 4,640 times the sine of 28 to equal h. You can bring over a calculator. 4,640. Let's be sure we're in the correct mode first. So we have to hit the mode key, and you see that we're in degree. It's required that we're in degree. If you're using a scientific calculator, most likely that's already in degree. If you're using a graphing calculator, there's a good chance that it might be in radian if you haven't switched it yet. Times the sine of 28. So it's got a vertical height of 2,178. You are 50 feet from the screen at a drive-in movie theater. Your eye is on the horizontal line with the bottom of the screen, and the angle of elevation is 58. How tall is the screen? So we make a triangle, and the screen standing up perpendicular, so we know this is a right triangle. We're trying to figure out the height of this screen. So what trig function would we use by the given information? Opposite over adjacent. Remember SOH CAH TOA. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. And tangent is opposite over adjacent. So opposite and adjacent. Adjacent means next to. So the tangent of 58 equals the opposite side to the adjacent side. We can turn this into a proportion by putting it over 1. Cross multiply to get 50 times tangent of 58. H times 1 is just h. Use our calculator. 50 times the tangent of 58. We get 80.02. And that is, if we have our units, that's in feet. You're using an extension ladder to paint the chimney. The length of the extension ladder ranges in 1 foot increments from a minimum length to its maximum. For safety, you should always use the angle of elevation of 75.5 degrees with the ground. You place the base of the ladder 3 feet. How many feet should the ladder be? So we know that we have this triangle, and we're 3 feet from the wall, from the chimney. We've got a 75.5 degrees, and the question is, how long is the ladder? So you got to understand what the question is before you can ever answer it. You got to know where the information is that you're working with. From the 75 degree point of view, 3 is adjacent and the x is the hypotenuse. So thinking of SOH CAH TOA, we're going to use adjacent over hypotenuse. Adjacent over hypotenuse, I know that that's going to be the cosine. Cosine of the angle equals the adjacent side to the hypotenuse. Place that over 1 and cross multiply. And then we would need to divide by the cosine of 75.5. So 3 divided by the cosine of 75.5. We get 11.98. And again, we're looking here at 1 foot increments. For the last question, we're working with a skyscraper, big tall building. You're standing here, 42 degrees to the top of the building. The building's 780 feet tall. Your friend is standing closer to the building. When they look up, they're looking at a 71 degree angle. The question is, how far are we here? So you got to come up with some plans. How could we possibly solve for the distance between you and your friend? Well, if we took the big triangle, (42 degrees), and we found out that total distance that it takes to get to the building, and then still 780 feet tall building. This time we're at 71 degrees, where your friend stands. We need to figure out how close they are to the building. And once you do that, then we can subtract the two to see what would be left over. So we're going to do tangent of 42 degrees equals opposite over adjacent. Put it over 1, cross multiply, so using our calculator, we're going to get 780 divided by the tangent of 42. That gives us 86628. And that's feet. Then we're going to do tangent again, but this time we're going to have the angle of 71. Cross multiply. Divide by the tangent of 71. So we have 780 divided by the tangent of 71. Now you're 268.58 feet. So if we're 866.28 and this is where your friend's standing, 268.58. What is x? What is the distance here? What's the distance between you and your friend? So we're going to take the 866.28, that's the whole distance. We're going to minus the 268.58, that's this little bit here. That's going to give us the leftover amount. 866.28 minus 268.58, and we're going to get 597.7 feet.